It seems counterintuitive that people on the left would find common ground with radical Islamists. One Washington think tank highlights why they are coming together and why some liberals are covering for jihadist violence.
The idea behind Islamophobia, which is...
These three observers accuse some on the left of being in cahoots at times with radical Islam, and if not actually cooperating, at least covering up for and excusing the violent acts of these jihadists. This despite the fact that history shows radical Islamists, once they gain power, would likely wipe out their leftist collaborators, like happened in revolutionary Iran.
They're the first to get their throats slit.
Gregory Angelo, head of the largest GOP gay organization, points out how some Muslims overseas routinely slaughter homosexuals.
Where you have ISIS throwing people off of roofs, where in Iran you are not just imprisoned but executed for being gay or just suspected of being gay.
But left-leaning gays won't call these Muslims on it, even though ISIS and others would murder them if given the chance. Angelo can't believe some gays won't condemn such forces.
Especially those who seek to eradicate LGBT individuals from the face of the earth.
Maybe the left shouldn't be attaching itself to these medieval totalitarian butchers who will kill them once they assume power.
Even in America, many refused at first to accept an ISIS wannabe killed 49 people at Orlando's Pulse nightclub.
What else could it be when somebody goes into a gay nightclub and starts shooting people at random? You know, I'm guessing it wasn't Methodists or Amishmen.
But even in Orlando, the shooter actually told police, "I am an agent of Islamic State, Allahu Akbar."
And yet some on the left blame the anti-gay hatred of Republican lawmakers or evangelical Christians. Anything but call out and condemn Islamic jihadis.
A liberal tack that sees everything but the actual threat that's in front of it. And not only that, but seeks to blame everything except for what is truly responsible, and that is radical Islam.
In Vadum's new book, Team Jihad, he suggests the radical left buddies up with Islamists because both have a totalitarian mindset with a common goal, wiping out Western democracy's open form of government.
To undermine the United States and Western civilization as a whole.
And for these leftists, that means...
The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
But Frank Gaffney, head of the Center for Security Policy, points out it's often the liberal nations that are the most accommodating and excusing of Islamist anti-Western ways that get the worst attacks, like Sweden, which Gaffney argues has been somewhat ripped asunder.
At the edge of, or actually in, a civil war with the primarily, I guess, transplanted populations from the Middle East now taking over something like 61 so-called no-go zones in the country, and increasingly parts of the country are simply being lost.
Islam means submission, and these panelists suggested submitting is what many left-leaning groups and even whole nations are doing, especially in Europe.
The nothing to see here culture that you're seeing pervading all of Europe. I mean, I have lost count, stopped counting the number of times where Islamists have attacked people in the public square.
But many leaders are afraid to fight back or even name the threat for fear of being labeled Islamophobic. These are in the kind of countries that pass laws, so...
It would be hate speech to criticize Islam there.
The Sharia is coming to the UK!
So that even those who would speak out against it feel that they cannot because they would automatically be marginalized. It's not only chilling, but it is literally dangerous.
Cardinal George Pell, the third highest-ranking Vatican official, was charged with child sex abuse today in his home country, Australia. The alleged assaults happened decades ago.
I'm looking forward, finally, to having my day in court.
This morning, Cardinal George Pell was defiant as he faced reporters.
I'm innocent of these charges. They are false. The whole idea of sexual abuse is abhorrent to me.
Australian police did not provide specifics, only referring to the charges as historical sexual assault offenses. In the past, Pell was criticized for not doing more to stop clergy sex abuse in his native Australia, and was questioned via video link from Rome in 2016.
With the experience of 40 years later, certainly I would agree that I should have done more.
Why do you need the experience of 40 years later? Wasn't it a serious matter then?
Yes, but people had a different attitude to them.
You cover the Vatican. What do charges like this do to this institution?
Well, I think it's very serious.
Joshua McElwee of the National Catholic Reporter says charges against Pell renew criticism of the church.
The church has been trying to move beyond the scandal to assure people that children are at the center of their concern. But when something like this happens, of course, there's a lot of questions raised about what's happening and whether they're doing enough.
German lawmakers voted to legalize gay marriage today. The bill gives same-sex couples in Germany full marital rights and allows them to adopt children. Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel announced after the vote she believes marriage is between a man and a woman, but she hopes the decision will lead to, quote, social cohesion and peace.
This Fayetteville plant, 80 miles upstream from Wilmington, is where Gen X is manufactured by DuPont and Chemours. Company officials recently revealed the chemical has been released into the river for nearly 4 decades.
It caught us all off guard.
Wilmington Mayor Bill Saffo.
We don't know what this is going to do to us that have been drinking it for long periods of time.
A 3-year study by North Carolina State University and the EPA out this past fall showed an elevated presence of Gen X in Wilmington's tap water. But the findings weren't publicly disclosed until this month.
So I ask all of you to keep this going until our water is clean.
Last week's city council meeting was standing room only.
Why has this been allowed to go on for so long? I've been drinking this water my entire life.
The long-term health effects of Gen X are unknown, but studies submitted by DuPont to the EPA have shown it caused tumors and reproductive problems in lab animals.
What you gonna do now?
Lisa Grogan's son Nathan battled a rare kidney cancer. She, like many other parents of children with cancer in the area, aren't pointing fingers, but are wondering whether toxins in their drinking water were the cause.
Because of what our kids have been through, I think it's hard for people to look at us and say, the water's probably okay. We're not willing to accept that risk.
Amy Herman's son Jacob had leukemia.
It just seems odd that we're having to fight for clean water, after we've fought for our children's lives.
There are currently no federal drinking water standards for Gen X, and under EPA rules, DuPont and Chemours' release of Gen X into the water may have been perfectly legal. That's because it's a byproduct of another substance.
There is a loophole that needs to be looked at by Congress to make certain that we have safe, good drinking water in this country.
State inspectors are now testing the current levels of Gen X in Wilmington's water, and the EPA is also investigating.
We, as citizens of this nation, need to know what those chemicals are, so at least we can make decisions for our own families as to whether we should drink the water or not.
Congressional Republicans have moved to stop the IRS from enforcing a rule that prevents pastors or churches from endorsing political candidates. House Republicans quietly included a provision in a sweeping spending bill that would deny the IRS the money to enforce the 63-year-old rule, which is known as the Johnson Amendment. Some Democrats say the measure comes too close to mixing church and state, but Republicans say the IRS rule is enforced unevenly. They say some churches in Democratic areas are openly supportive of political candidates, even allowing some to speak from the pulpits, while some conservative churches try to avoid even the appearance of being political. The measure will be considered by the Appropriations Committee after Congress's recess for the 4th of July.
Every day, 60 school bus drivers get into accidents. That's about 22,000 bus crashes a year, injuring thousands of students. But the problems are much worse than just traffic accidents. Our CBS News investigation found a stunning lack of oversight of school bus drivers. On average, at least once a week, a driver is arrested for driving under the influence.
I caught a big whiff of alcohol.
Or child pornography.
And what was on that computer?
Some underage.
pictures.
Or even sexually assaulting a child.
And when I look into her eyes, I can still see it.
This New York couple, who didn't want to be identified, told us their special needs daughter was assaulted behind a church by her driver when she was 15.
He would pick her up, make her get out of the bus, and then do whatever he wanted to do.
The family says the driver, Ronaldo Vega, should never have been behind the wheel. He'd been arrested a year earlier on suspicion of child abuse, but was allowed to keep his job. The charges were eventually dropped, but Vega pleaded guilty to assaulting their daughter.
There shouldn't have even been an issue. He just shouldn't have been driving these kids.
School bus drivers have to get a commercial driver's license, but because few drive across state lines, many federal safety rules do not apply. So while drivers with disqualifying medical conditions would not be able to work for a company like Greyhound, they could drive a school bus. Transportation attorney Steve Gersten.
Truck drivers that are driving heads of lettuce or television sets actually have to meet higher safety standards than the people that drive our children on school buses.
This driver was busted for DUI in Connecticut, one of only 2 states keeping track of all drivers arrested on the job. 21 states told us no school bus drivers had been charged with DUI in the past 3 years, but we found at least one such arrest in each of those states.
There are no universal standards. So there's nothing that automatically will disqualify a school bus driver who, let's say, has an extensive criminal background or DUIs or has caused too many crashes.
Alexander Rodriguez was hired to drive a school bus in Tennessee, even though his background check flagged criminal charges in New Jersey for having a weapon and drugs in a school zone. A few years later, he pleaded guilty to the statutory rape of a 15-year-old student who rode his bus.
Parents assume when they put their children on a school bus that that driver is safe. These parents really need to be asking who's driving their children.
Complicating the situation, last year 90% of school districts reported a shortage of bus drivers. One of the largest school bus companies in the country, Durham School Services, has turned to Craigslist to find drivers, even calling former employees like Kelly Shane Hooper, who was hired despite being under investigation for multiple charges of child pornography.
I got a phone call from my old job. They were offering me my job back because they were short. $12.80 an hour. You can get up here quickly.
The school bus industry refused all of our requests for interviews. This child survived. The driver stayed on the job, leaving parents wondering who's watching out for their children.
The city of Pensacola, Florida has decided to fight to keep an historical cross from being torn down. The Bayview Park Cross was first erected in 1941 under the direction of President Franklin D. Roosevelt as part of an Easter sunrise service. But a federal court ordered the 34-foot monument removed after a lawsuit claimed the cross violated the Constitution and was offensive to non-Christians. And hundreds of Pensacola residents who want to see the massive cross stay put have now rallied around it, and they did that last week.
Almost annually, crosses were erected at this site. Sunrise services were held here. Thousands of people participated, and the military also participated in terms of the chaplains giving the message, bands playing and so forth. So in one form or another, it has been at this location since 1941. Great historical significance, showing that even our federal government at one time was erecting crosses on public property.
Pensacola's Mayor Ashton Hayward told The Pulse the Constitution does not require us to erase our history just because part of that history is religious. The city has retained the legal service of the Washington, D.C.-based Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. It has agreed to take on the city's appeal at no charge.